Continuing, You Can Change the World, The Christopher Approach by James Keller. Everything's Alright in Kokomo is one. Don't know if we'll finish this one. In one program. A few months ago, while traveling through Indiana, giving talks in the smaller towns and cities of the state, one thing more than any other impressed itself on me. It was the quality of the people who made up the various audiences. Farmers and factory workers, small businessmen, and housewives. In short, the sound, solid folk who are the backbone of America. No wild-eyed, irrational heads in the clouds visionaries were they. Now, some of that isn't irrational. Sometimes it isn't wild. It's just that people see possibilities. And sometimes it takes a whole group of people to figure out, some of that. To realize it, too. On the contrary, on their faces were the calm, down-to-earth expressions of people possessed of an honest sense of values. In their eyes was the quiet confidence born of such knowledge. If ever a description fitted a group of individuals, it was the phrase, salt of the earth. And, in one talk, frankly, I told them so. If we had people with your plain common sense teachings in our colleges, running our government, our trade unions, writing our newspapers, magazines, books, radio programs, and movie scenarios, I said everything would be pretty much all right with our country and the world. After the talk, one middle-aged gentleman came up to me. He seemed neither angry nor pleased with what I had just observed, but, taking my hand, said simply, "I come from Kokomo, and everything's all right in Kokomo." If he had launched into a tirade of criticism or disagreement, his words would not have startled me half as much as that quiet statement of fact. I come from Kokomo, and everything's all right in Kokomo. Though he failed to realize it, that one little remark sums up only too well what is probably the chief obstacle to peace in the world. Most good people are taking care of only themselves, while most evil people are taking care of everyone else. Most people with good ideas are thinking in small circles and in terms of 1,000 separate Kokomos, while the people who are out to wreck our civilization are planning and acting on a long-term daring scale in terms of centuries and over the span of the world. Now, one has to be careful with some of those claims, right? It isn't entirely one race or one religious group that these people come from, and we need to speak based on knowledge when we talk about these conspiracies. And we should also realize that even though of the top and of the second tier, you're looking at mostly from one group, it's not the religion that's motivating these things. The people who are, The hope that is Kokomo. To know that everything is all right in Kokomo, however, is encouraging. Thank God for it. But for us, the refreshing hope in that knowledge is to release into the bloodstream of the whole country and the arteries of the world the confined goodness which makes Kokomo and communities like it what they are. And tens upon tens of thousands of people of every age and in all walks of life are doing just that right now. They are getting out of themselves and into the thick of things. They are exerting their tremendous influence for good and hastening the day when peace will, once more, come to all mankind. And that word, tremendous, is not misused. For instance, still fresh in people's memories is the recent gigantic letter-writing campaign directed by the American people to the people of Italy, telling them what freedom and democracy mean in the United States. Well, America was never a democracy. I hear that some of the Native American tribes were. There's certainly accounts that would indicate that that was the case, but democracy means the United States. Well, then it's Aristotelian polity, really. SPQR isn't quite a democracy. It's closer than some systems. and what they would mean to Italians if they only appreciated these rights enough to work for them. Not just hundreds or even thousands, but literally millions of letters went out from people of Italian descent in every section of this nation to their relatives in the old country. Yet that campaign didn't just start by itself. Somebody started it. And that somebody was one man, a barber in Southampton, Long Island, New York. He had left Italy himself in 1913 and had come to the United States, determined to become a living part of our democracy for the rest of his days. He'd married, raised a family, and found good life. As the years went by, however, two things began to bother him. One was the constant stream of criticism from many quarters about what was wrong with our government and with the world in general. You can focus on what is right, too. That can be the approach. One was the constant... The second thing, and which irritated him even more than the first, was that those who did the complaining never seemed to do anything about making conditions any better. Following World War II, when news of millions of Italians flirting with communism reached the American press, his patience reached the breaking point. He decided to do something about it personally. First, he wrote to his own relatives in St. Catherine, Sicily. Next, he wrote to his wife's relatives, who lived near the same town, telling all of them what the free way of life meant in America. Then he got his oldest boy, a doctor, and his oldest girl, a dietitian, to write. He sent letters to the president and to all the newspapers in the New York area, asking for their support. The reaction to the idea was invariably good, but invariably it was accompanied with regrets that the project was too big to handle. Various organizations, which he approached personally, received him with smiles and wished him well, and that was all. Faced with having the whole idea collapse on the spot, this barber still wouldn't quit. He kept writing and contacting his friends, who had relatives in the old country, asking them to lend a hand. Gradually, providentially, the idea began to catch fire. Businessmen, young GI brides, housewives, veterans, groups, civic societies, and religious leaders took up the flight. Soon a steady trickle, and in no time at all became a torrent of heartfelt letters of thanks started coming back from Italy, promising to push the democratic concept of life. The result, hundreds of thousands of people in America began to do something no other agency or official group could possibly have done. Reach the hearts of the Italian people. And remember, one man started it all. One man personally was responsible for all this because he got out of his own little world with its little ideas and into the big world with all its breathtaking potentialities. Other situations, other workers. Other men and other women, in less spectacular ways, perhaps, but with equally far-reaching results, are carrying their individual Kokomos in the battle for a better world. In the University of Wisconsin at this moment, one particular teacher is there at a great personal sacrifice simply because he finally realized how much more good he could do in the classroom than by pursuing a successful business career. Once he had been a teacher, but had given it up, as he put it, to make more money on the outside. The money had come all right, but with it, no real peace of mind. The situation annoyed him. More than that, it puzzled him. Here he was almost everything anyone could want, and he wasn't happy. It was fantastic, unbelievable. Yet he happened across a Christopher pamphlet. He was at a loss to know the reason. Reading it, he found out. And getting ahead in the world and thinking only of himself. He was neglecting the good of others, particularly the youngsters he had been trained to teach. So back to the classroom he went, and back to the satisfaction of knowing he was doing the most for his fellow men in the best way he knew how. In a sense, this teacher turned businessman, turned teacher, had unconsciously been conducting an experiment with himself. Personal names used in relating incidences whenever the information has already been made public are used. In other instances, names have been withheld, usually at the request of the individual concerned. He had been testing his own reactions to a problem, which involved engrossing himself in selfish rather than selfless interests, and he had found the formula unsatisfactory. Only when the proper equation or relationship between himself and his neighbor was realized did he count the experiment a success. And speaking of experiments, just recently a scientist in the research laboratory of the Eastman Kodak Company, who had learned about the Christophers and what they were doing, sent us this letter. "You're on the right track," he wrote. "I've been in the scientific field most of my life and have seen the wonderful things it's done. Lately, however, I've noticed a pagan trend becoming more apparent." Now, remember, until 1967, all monotheists were called pagan and heathen in Catholic Church services. Much of our scientific development in this country proceeds from the old German school, which threw out the idea of God and the supernatural and paved the way for Hitler. Actually, okay, then maybe that pagan thing would make sense because Hitler did not confine himself to speaking to Christianity, or in Christian ways. Of course, pretty much everything pre-Christian just got relabeled as Christian. So, the swastika comes from, the design came from a church that Hitler attended, but, and the German Christian movement before the NSDAP. But anyways, the only way to correct this condition, as you say, is to bring back Christian values into the teaching end of science. Maybe I can help in this. Anyway, I am giving up my present job and becoming a science teacher at $1,000 less a year. At a convention on the West Coast recently, the world's need for democracy was being discussed by the delegates at considerable length, with varying shades of opinion. In a corner of the huge meeting hall, a housewife sat listening intently as the talk flowed on for the better part of 2 hours. Now, the NSDAP, weren't they more democratic than America? That's something to consider, right? Without approval of the elite. I mean, there were a lot of problems with NSDAP, right? But their problem, their criticism of the elite has been why calling people Nazi is a scapegoat term, although it was before Hitler came to power too. It's a Hebrew word for overseer. It was used as a slur by a group even worse, the USSR. But some people among them, but anyways. Though she kept her silence, inside her was an undercurrent of excitement that was in sharp contrast to her earlier decision to pass up the convention and let her alternate go in her place. She'd felt, so inadequate. Conventions were something new to her. She knew nothing about their methods of procedure, nor even what each delegate was supposed to do, and she almost made up her mind that it was useless for her to attend. Then the thought occurred to her that if everyone passed up the opportunity to do something constructive for the country, even if that something was very small, the nation could be lost by default. Quietly, she listened to what the other delegates had to say. The feeling of excitement inside her now mingled with the mounting impatience at their ideas on democracy, which sounded so confused and superficial. Finally, she stood up and quietly suggested to the convention chairman that it might be well to define democracy. "What does the word mean?" she asked, and listened to the murmur of surprise that swept the hall. Several delegates offered halting, uncertain replies. When they'd finished, the housewife stood up again. "It is interesting to note," she observed, "that many definitions have been submitted, yet not one has included the basic idea which our founding fathers considered so important, that they put it right at the beginning of the Declaration of Independence. Namely, each individual man, woman, and child receives his rights from God, not from the state. And one of the chief purposes of the state is to protect and respect those God-given rights. When she sat down, no one was more surprised than she at the volley of applause that greeted her words. In one simple statement, she had distinguished between Christian democracy and pagan totalitarianism. And, but again, the NSDAP was full of Christians. So, Hitler said he would not tolerate criticism of Christianity in more than one speech. And pagan and heathen, again, has nothing to do with religion, and it's not right to use insults about, oh, these are the country folk. Yeah, the country folk. Well, yeah. People who wanted to, the Romans and the Greeks didn't use these terms for different types of cults. They just, the poor people who couldn't have masons build their homes. That this woman did personally and individually typifies the whole spirit of the Christopher approach. As one man himself interested in the field of labor relations put it in a recent letter from San Francisco, the magic of the Christopher idea, the shift from selfish defensive to unselfish offensive, has made me happier than I have been in a long time, and in such a fundamental way. Now I shall plunge into the study of labor legislation with added fire. Of equal interest, and in a field so much in the public eye of late, is the case of a young lady of the Jewish faith who made her voice heard very effectually at the communist-dominated meetings which she was accustomed to attend. Deeply concerned with the basic sacred worth of each individual, she found her chance to express herself when a measure which violated the principles for which she stood came up for discussion on the floor one day. Though she was the only non-communist sufficiently interested to attend this particular meeting, she got up and told the rest of the gathering in a courteous, friendly manner what she thought about the bill and the policy of the Union in general. Her words were received in stony silence. The expressions on most of the Unionists' faces were openly scornful. The few others, it was impossible to tell what they were thinking. When the vote was taken after the discussion had ended, 60 out of 75 Union members present voted in favor of the measure. Only one, this Jewish girl, voted against it, but 14 communist sympathizers present abstained from voting. So impressed were they by the courage and conviction of this one girl. Afterwards, they came up to her, singly and in groups of twos and threes, and told her so. They didn't cease being party liners right then and there, naturally, but the fact is, a start had been made in the right direction. For once, they did not vote the party line. And people need to stop acting like conservative and liberal are party line. No, conservative tends to be the party line is actually people who are like, well, I'll, support whatever and they do because I have to support my candidate and all this. It's that's something else again. Here, there, and everywhere. Literally and figuratively, this girl got into the thick of things. She was alone. There was no friendly voice to shout encouragement, not even a perfunctory hand clap when she sat down. Yet she made others respect her for what she believed, even though the fact will never be bragged about in Communist Party headquarters. Hers was a daring type of courage, but it isn't the only kind. Others, no less courageous, work, quietly doing good. And sometimes the good they do means a sacrifice to others besides themselves. In New York, a few months ago, a stockbroker whose business gave him ample opportunity to feel the pulse of the nation became alarmed when he realized the amazing inroads the communists had made in this country, especially in the field of government. His business associates apparently didn't recognize the dangers. But since he did, it was up to him to do something about it. His position in Wall Street involved high-level administrative skill, so he decided to try for a job in the State Department in Washington until he remembered. There were his wife and children to be considered. They had always been used to the best of they'd always been used to the best of everything. The finest clothes, the most modern luxuries of the home, and his wife in particular prized such possessions quite highly. If he went to Washington, he'd get far less money than he was making in New York. Weeks of talking things over followed, until at last they made their decision, sacrifice or not, they'd make the change. They've never regretted it. The ex-broker isn't big time anymore, just a man in a government office doing a job. But what a job. His wife doesn't dress so well now. Her clothes are not as new and smart as they used to be. In fact, they're beginning to show signs of too much wear. Yet, she doesn't care. The old phrase, clothes make the woman, in her case, is reversed. There is a radiance on her face that was never there when she was considered very much the fashion plate of style-conscious Manhattan. Doing things for love of one's fellow man does that to people. A Baptist lawyer down in Texas is another who is finding that out too. A man of about 45. He had been a captain in Army intelligence during the recent war, and what he saw of the attempts to undermine our country made him fighting mad. Not at anyone in particular, just fighting mad to do something about it. And one thing I can honor about the person whose interviews was the first that I've released this year is that he was not part of the whole globalist thing, right? And well, that means both ways. But you know what people mean when they say globalist. But yeah, somehow he heard about the Christophers, and not long ago, when I passed through Texas, oh, that guy's also in Texas too. He made it his business to see me. He asked my advice, but before I gave it, I put just 2 questions to him. Do you believe in the basic idea that our founding fathers put in the Declaration of Independence, that man is a child of God and gets his rights from God? That the problem of the state is to protect those rights? I sure do, he answered. Are you willing to do something really constructive about it? I sure am. Came back to the empathetic reply. I'll even give up half my law practice to do it. That is how important I think it is. My suggestion to him was simply to go around and give as many talks as he could at business functions, civic meetings, social gatherings, wherever the opportunity presented itself, and encourage people with good ideas to get into the 4 great fields of education: labor management, government, and the writing end of newspapers, radio, motion pictures, television, and so on. I told him also to try to have each person who heard him to get at least one other person to do the same thing, to get them working as hard, putting basic American ideals into these fields as the doers of evil were trying to pull them out. Now, one thing that's common with books that I've seen from this period is it's not democracy, it's one sort of nationalism, patriotic prejudice versus another. Of course, that's the driving force of war, right? More than any theological point combined, those material considerations. Better to light one candle than to curse the darkness. And I'll say it again. Cursing the darkness is probably going to be a lot more fun. I mean, don't moralize light and dark like that. But anyways, if he succeeds in doing just that, and if the people who hear him follow suit, then the darkness and confusion of evil and error in that part of the world, at least, will be illuminated by a light that cannot and will not be put out. Instead of complaining about evil, they will be doing good. An old Chinese proverb points up that fact so simply, yet so dramatically. Better to light one candle it goes than to curse the darkness. For a girl in a small California town, doing that meant the difference between a life of sickness and pain and grumbling frustration, and a life that has been and still is an inspiration to everyone around her. Weakened by a series of recurring epileptic fits, her condition was aggravated to the point that hospitalization was the only course left open to her. Lying in bed hour upon weary hour gave her plenty of time to think about the future. She felt sorry for herself, but after a time, even self-pity became a trifle tiresome. Looking around for something different to occupy her time, she got an idea. Perhaps if she tried to forget about her own troubles and tried to help others. No, that wasn't quite it. Perhaps if she tried to help others first, then her own troubles might seem less important, less hopeful. Though no literary genius, as she puts it, did have some flair for writing. So she asked the hospital authorities to contact the editor of the town newspaper. "I want to write a column," she told him, "a column that will try to make people concentrate on, well, the good in life around them, instead of always doing just the opposite." And she almost added, "like I've been doing." Fortunately, the paper wasn't bound by the space limitations of a big city daily, and the editor agreed to give her a chance. Within 3 or 4 weeks after the column first appeared, letters began pouring in, thanking her, giving her a mental pat on the back for what she was trying to do. And from that very first day on, this same girl has rarely suffered another attack of epilepsy. Doctors familiar with the case have not tried to minimize the change in her. Instead, they point out that the getting out of herself and out of her own narrow world has given her a purpose in life, has done away with the mental and emotional frustration which, in their opinion, was apparently responsible for a serious physical disorder. And while not attempting to generalize, they add that they know of similar cases where the cure was within the person himself as much as in any medical treatment. For each life purpose. Some of us realization To some of us, realization of the fact comes easily, but to others it comes only after some tremendous experience has shaken them out of their complacency and self-satisfaction. We can benefit from self-referral, can't we? A young ex-naval officer had spent 5.5 years on active service during the recent war, both with the Board of Economic Warfare and with the Photographic Division of the Armed Forces. In the first post, his job was to investigate and help allocate vital supplies to the countries assisting us and our allies in the war effort. In the second post, a lot of his work consisted in helping photograph much of the European mainland, the coast of Norway, and the rough terrain of Czechoslovakia in particular. Both jobs called for technical skill and an extraordinary capacity to evaluate material, and because of the complexities of modern warfare, evaluate men as well. However, when he was returned to inactive duty and began the task of getting back into the feel of civilian life, he found something had happened to him in the time he'd been away. While in uniform, he'd had a purpose to help him win for himself and his countrymen a victorious peace. All the inconvenience, the suffering, the ever-present threat of death had been made bearable because of that. Now that he was back in civies, he wanted his life to have a purpose, also a worthwhile goal to work toward, some field where he could do some good for others as well as for himself. It didn't call for us simply making money, either, as the offer of an $8,000 a year job with a big New York baking house, while it tempted him, didn't persuade him to the point of acceptance. The job meant security, but it also meant the plowing of an economic and social furrow that might become a rut as the years went by. So he decided, not without regret, that's not for me. Well, how about the movies? In Europe, he'd worked with several prominent Hollywood technicians and directors. Perhaps there was a place for him out there. But again, a blank wall. Oh, he was offered jobs all right, good ones too, yet with one exception. They paralleled too closely the Wall Street offer. Money, nothing more. The one exception possessed possibilities, more to his liking, but only for the immediate future. The turnover in this job is terrific. No matter how good you are, a friend on the inside told him, in a year or two, you'll be on the outside looking in. And once you're out, all your ideas, everything you've worked for, will wind up in some convenient wastebasket. If you want a job with a future, this isn't for you. Discouraging? Most assuredly, yes. Yet somehow, the movies, their creative values, and their wonderful potential for the communication of good to millions of people, still stuck in his mind. Driving along in his car one night, with a friend who happened to be a Christopher, he asked for, and got a solution to his dilemma. The answer, briefly, was this. As an exhibitor of motion pictures, that is, as an independent exhibitor, he would be in a position to encourage movies that were both entertaining and decent, and he could weed out and refuse to show any films that didn't meet these standards. This ex-naval officer knew next to nothing about the phase of the film industry, but he decided to learn. At a salary of $35 a week, he got a job in order to learn the field from the ground up. By the end of 18 months, remember, he had a purpose. He had learned his work so well that with the help of a bank loan, he is able to buy his own theater in an upstate New York college town. And incidentally, he is making more money than he would have earned if he'd taken the job first offered him in Wall Street. A motion picture executive, noticing his progress, commented recently that such a theater might well be the start of a string of theaters across the country similarly dedicated to showing only good screenplays. Now, who decides what's good, right? More importantly at the present, however, is the fact that this man has already influenced the lives of thousands of people by giving them the best in screen entertainment. If a picture doesn't deserve to be shown, I'll not show it, even if there's nothing else to be put on the screen in its place. He announced not long ago, if that happens, I'll close down the theater for a couple of days and put out a sign explaining why. In his spare time, this Christopher has completed a law course begun before he entered the service, and has also concerned himself in many activities offering opportunities to serve the general good. For example, you may remember the uproar in American press when Czechoslovakia succumbed to communist pressure from Moscow and had to hoist the red flag of surrender. Editorials proclaimed the catastrophe which had befallen a great people. The terse obituaries by radio commentators went out to every corner of the country, telling the soda jerker in Des Moines, the secretary in New York, the salesgirl in San Francisco, of the latest manifestation of tyranny which had been flung in their faces from across the sea. Well, they got to do better explaining why that's tyranny, but corporatism, communism, yeah. And in the case of Long Island, one Long Island barber, one man, this theater owner, did something about it, and did with it equally far-reaching results.